Welcome. I'm David Eichholtz with David Richard Gallery. We're located in New York City, and we're actually standing in our newest location in New York City, our second location, which is located in Chelsea Art District, and we're on West 26th Street. So the address is 508 West 26th Street. And we're standing in front of paintings, and next to me here is Carl Hazlewood. And these are paintings of Carl's that are our first debut exhibition of this work, and actually Carl's, so this is our inaugural exhibition for the gallery, his debut with our gallery. And they're interesting body of work, and that's kind of what we want to focus on. Carl lives and works here in New York City and has been living in the US. Well, you came in the 60s in Houston, and then you ended up in New York in the 70s.
Exactly.
And you've been here pretty much ever since. And his studio is located over in Brooklyn. And he's originally from Guyana. So it's amazing how many other artists from Guyana live here. And at your opening, I was just so surprised how many lived just right around the corner. So there's a huge community here. It's just really kind of interesting.
Well, it's huge relative to the population, which is a smaller population. But,
But amazing creativity and such a diversity of work as well. Now, a lot of them are kind of more your colleagues and friends and your age group. So, but anyway, it's the opening was fantastic, and we met a lot of great new people. So this work would intrigue me. Carl and I have been talking to each other for a number of years, actually, and he's had some different studios around in residence programs and here in New York City. And I recently, his current residence is at, residency program is at Art Cake.
Yes.
In Brooklyn. And so I went to visit him, and he had a number of things that he brought from other places that I had not seen before. And so I saw a couple of these, and I was so surprised, and because they don't look aesthetically like his current work. And I could tell they were older works, and so I was really intrigued with them, and he was so surprised that I think you were surprised that I liked them.
That's right, yes.
So much. And so I said, I'd love to do a show of these, and I thought, he didn't know how many he had, and he thought it was a small number, and so I thought, well, we'll just do them, in one of the small rooms or project rooms or something, because we're preparing for a show of newer work, which is, much larger than these. And it turns out he found 14 of them. So there are a series that he had done from 1996 to 2003. And what's important about them, and the reason why I like this, is they sort of encapsulate a large range of his career. So these are triptychs, and each panel, so, you see this aesthetic difference here that represents each a different panel. And the format's pretty much the same, with a large central piece of art here, and then flanked by two smaller verticals. And that's the general sort of format. But what's significant about them is these are paintings from the 70s and 80s, largely. And the way Carl described it to me is he had these much larger paintings, really large paintings that he used to do that were sort of in this post-painterly abstraction sort of format that were sort of stained, but went way beyond that. I mean, we'll zoom in on some of these. You can see they're heavily textured, and they're all rooted in color. And we'll get to sort of the other aspect of that, the formal quality and sort of where these come from, and the grounding of them. But just in terms of just these particular paintings, when Carl made those larger paintings, he always painted stretch, but a lot of times you described to me 100% of the painting, or you thought some parts didn't look quite as great in that composition. So you sort of reformat them and create a different composition. And he saved all of those salvage and the residue from all of those. And he decided in '96 or so to start looking back at his work. And the show is actually called Demerara Dreaming. And it's paintings from 1996 to 2003. And Demerara is a county and a river where you grew up and were born and grew up in Guyana. And so you started making these, and in that format, and that's what I guess I'd like for you to. That's sort of how they're composed. But why don't you get into sort of why Demerara Dreaming?
Okay. Yeah, well, being an immigrant is it's an interesting space to be. Even as a young person coming from there to here, there was always that experience of this other place. And in a way, you miss it, or it becomes something that's generative in a poetical sense.
The homeland?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think at that time, needing a break from the other things I was doing at the same time, and trying to take up from where I left off with the large paintings. The large paintings were all entitled Demerara something, because they all refer to a sort of landscape feeling or environmental feeling, or something poetically that I felt related to the pieces.
Right.
Nobody else needed to feel that, but it was important for me as a generative kind of fuse. So when I, to keep working while I was doing these other things, curating and so on, I started making these pieces because I found I had leftover canvas, like you explained, and I had some stretchers and bars, which are roughly about this size. So it seemed logical to use those pieces, and also I didn't want a sort of a complete field thing, an open, continuous thing. I needed to have a sort of a structure I could work with and repeat, and that would structure the work without being overbearing.
Right.
So I started doing these one after the other.
But there was an inherent limitation, given that a lot of these were salvage and scrap.
They were.
So you couldn't do something really big.
Exactly.
So it sort of created an inherent limitation, and you just sort of created this format, which I really like, because you made 25 or so of these things, and you gifted a lot of them away, and also forgot to point out, this is the first time these have ever been presented as a group.
Exactly.
And in fact, so many of his friends, and that's what really struck me, is they're walking in, they go, I'm here to see Carl, Hazlewood show. And they said it very questioningly, and I'm like, this is it. And they're like, what? This is Carl Hazlewood's work. and a lot of people that you'd met here in this country, or even people from Guyana, but you'd met them here, not there.
Right.
They were like, wow, I've never seen these. But then I explained to them that they're from the 70s
Actually,
and 80s.
I'd never seen them. Like together,
But I explained to them they were paintings from the 70s and 80s, and they're like going, oh, for heaven's sakes, I've never seen any of those paintings in person or whatever. Or they said, oh yeah, I remember them, but I haven't seen that many of them. So it was just sort of interesting to people's reactions. And people loved them. Yeah,
well, it's a revelation to me too, because I hadn't focused on them, I hadn't seen them together. Now in this beautiful, clean, well-lit space, it's I know there's nothing like a freshly renovated gallery. It's just, you hate to put that first nail in, but there you go. But the structure of them, I decided to keep it at that sort of format, because it imposed a rule that I could keep working against.
And sometimes those limitations force creativity.
Yeah, and also it became a sort of a poetic structure, sort of like a poem. You have one stanza, you have another, and they sort of interact and build or even out, depending on how they're put together. So that's more or less the structure. I was going for poetry rather than formalism. But if the two interacted, that was a good thing. Because
that's another thing a lot of people don't realize, is that you also, not only do you love poetry, but you actually write a lot of poetry. So you write a lot about art and about other artists and their work, and sort of art historical and critical, and sort of in a little bit sometimes romantic sort of way. And as you said, I think poetic is a term you use quite a bit. And I noticed that, and because I ask you if there's a narrative in these, because a lot of times when you see things linear, you inherently, first of all, see, or horizontal, you think landscape, which these do have that feel, but these also feel very astral and celestial. But the other thing too you think of as often is it's like reading a line left to right. It's like there's a narrative in here.
Yeah.
And that's when I asked you about that and you said, no, it's really more like stanzas of a poem. And then you said, well, maybe there was a little bit of narrative. But, and I think because of the dreaming aspect of what you had mentioned about the, thinking fondly back in memory and assembling these, then there probably is a little bit of romanticism or as you say, poetics or some sort of a narrative in there. But by and large, the other question a lot of people ask is, and this is a great one to do. So you did tell me you've never overpainted or touched them up or anything.
No.
And so what people are curious about is, did you just frame a bunch of, or stretch a bunch of them up, these sizes, and then just kind of put them together? Or did you actually see pieces and thought, oh, this would be a nice composition, and then did it that way?
Yeah, well, this I'm thinking about this stuff for myself also, so I'm finding out things. So I know it was rather intentional. It wasn't you put a bunch of stuff in
within a composition.
But once I made one panel, I looked around and I actually consciously found something that
worked together.
With it.
Gotcha.
Either coloristically, texturally, whether it's in contrast or something that just flowed.
Yeah.
Tonally, or it's difficult to put in words. My own work, but that's part of what it is. Well,
they remind me a little bit of something that you said when I was interviewing you on a couple of those discussions is a lot of, one of the things you've always liked is the, like you said, the soil and the clay and that sort of neutralized backdrop in Guyana.
Right.
And then this strong contrast with in people's gardens with flowers or the leaves or the light and how the light at different times of the day really make things look like they're glowing and almost sort of fluorescent.
Right.
And I noticed that in these assemblages that you do have a lot of sort of neutralized areas and then these great sort of eye-popping smaller fragments. And I can only just imagine what the bigger painting, the segment that this came out of, which is what's always people are just kind of then curious about is like, well, what in the world did the rest of that painting look like?
I don't think. I think I have one or two at a friend's house, so I'll have to go dig them up. But most of them were actually sold.
Good
which
for
was
you.
Great. Which was great. but they were more expansive, open. They weren't exactly color field.
Right.
They were related, but I didn't want just the simplified feel. I wanted some sort of inflection that would make them more dynamic in a way, while still feeling open.
Well, and that's how these come across to me, is that this is like a bit of a field, even though you've got speckles and other things going in. Right. This is a little more neutralized, and then it's just these great sort of eye-popping colors.
Yeah.
And then the more fieldish-like composition, some fragment, is actually the least field in here. But the color of these two are just really make it such a bigger, more dynamic piece.
Right.
And this one, though, is nice, as you say, where there's not a huge contrast. But in here, this one does take the show because when you come in, I don't know if Yao can zoom in or not a little bit, but the paintwork that you did in here, it's obviously, very experimental and just sort of going with the flow here, but you have some
flow is
like
a good
dry
word.
pigment. Yeah, flow is a good word. Where the dry pigment is just sort of bleeding and it's sort of exploding, and then you went in and touched up here and there or not touch up, but to introduce like this hot fluorescent pink or this bright lime green, and then these little effects here that look almost like something underwater.
Exactly.
So it gives it a very celestial or underwater sort of feel.
The name Guyana is sort of an Indian word. Indigenous Indian word meaning land of many waters. So it's interesting that...
Say the word again?
Guyana, it's...
Guyana itself, okay, yeah.
It's an Indian word meaning land of many waters.
Land of many waters.
Because there's lots of waterfalls and so on.
Right.
away from the city. But that liquid quality is that flowing quality, I think,
is ever present.
It's part of that feel, you know. Of course, it intersected with what was going on at the time, the kind of painting that was going on at the time in New York, where I was, you know. But it made it personal to me.
Yeah.
You know, so
the landscape's always been a huge influence for you. You said, I mean, you always liked the atmospheric painting of like the Hudson Valley School and many European artists.
True, yeah, because we were more connected. Guyana was more connected with, say, Europe and England and so on. So the people I looked at first were British, you know, Turner and these people. I loved Turner because it looked so abstract. Even as a child, not knowing what abstraction is, I could see there was something there that I was responding to, you know, and so there was that, and I think it persisted. Not only because there were physical reasons, the way I see, which is very. Without my glasses, there are explosions of color and so on. You know, I don't see specific things. So part of the way I see is blobs of color. So I think part of that translates into what I do as a painter.
Right.
So in that way, it's almost a self-portrait. You know,
interesting.
The things I do become aspects of my own personality, even my physical presence, you know. So it's
and that also speaks a lot to your current work, which is probably even more high contrast.
Yeah.
With less color, more neutralized ground, but the color that's there is very bold and very strong, and a lot of use of primary colors, reds and yellows and things like that.
Yeah, I think after the sensibility-based kind of things, the newer work, I wanted to clarify things, to do not do anything that was unnecessary. So I began to think of how could I use something that's ready-made that I wouldn't have to repeat my motions that I already knew. So my current work uses some pre-existing things in combination with some handwork. So it's almost like this, you're picking things, choosing things.
When you use really diverse materials anymore too, lots of different like mylar and films and sometimes construction materials,
fabric, thread.
So, and that was the other thing too is you're really very much, color is really at the heart of all of your work. We've touched on landscape and Demerara and Guyana, but what I think really in discussions with you and just looking more and more at your work, color really is at the heart of everything that you do. And so what was interesting when you explained to me about the way you approach color is more not a literalness as much as a perceptual feel you get from color at different times of the day and looking at different objects or places or locations. And a lot of it, as you said, was often landscape or plant matter or things around you, but even people. And so a lot of, like you said, color as you see it, even if it's like in a plant or in an object or a person, different colored people, you get this vibe and feeling from that interaction between light and surface and color.
Exactly.
And that's what these are. So much of it too is, it seems like memory. You're painting from memory or from more of an emotional place or setting.
Exactly. I guess that's because, I've accumulated degrees and stuff along the way, but I've been doing this as a child without knowing anything about museums or galleries. I was always painting or writing or doing that sort of thing because I was confined. I was a sick, ill kid, So I was confined to home and homeschooled, and my existence was in books, looking at pictures, and analyzing them and thinking, fantasizing, science fiction. You could go out of space in your head, You could travel away from the palm trees that I saw outside the window and be somewhere else where it snowed or something, and you wondered about the texture of that stuff. It's cold, or sitting by my mother and her sewing machine, and bits of pieces of cloth, shiny cloth, and buttons and stuff that are colorful, and they fell on the floor, and I like these nice shiny little things,
Yeah.
And
Just like
it's funny that I've come around to those shiny little pieces, little pieces of
Exactly.
things now, So everything relates to everything, and like I said, it's a continuing portrait that's being built over time.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way of thinking about your work over, gosh, almost 5 decades. Sorry about that.
Unfortunately.
We're all getting older. But I think it's that because you root everything in the color and your perceptions of color in your childhood and that backdrop, that you described in there, growing up in Guyana. It is amazing, as you and I were talking, initially when you look at something, you think, well, that looks totally different. Even your photography, because Carl also has gotten into photography over the last couple decades. And, and he's got a camera around his neck right now.
My third eye.
but it's that the compositions may be different materials and of different content, but when you just break it down into compositions and ignore the subject matter, they really are amazingly related. And that's what is sort of interesting looking at your work. But you've explored this through not only your writing and poetry, but in painting, photography, it seems like, and you love doing drawings and small collages and things like that. And then, and now these larger, I don't know how when you describe your larger wall works today, to me they always look like paintings, but they're really assemblages of a lot of different materials.
Well, I think I still define myself as a painter, even though these things happen. I think, was it Stella said, a sculpture is just a painting cut out and stood up someplace, which was something very funny to say, but in a way it's true. We have these structures that are creations of form,
Right.
and you interpret these things differently according to your own response to the world and how you feel in a particular space, how you relate to the ceiling, to the floor, to the walls, And these are things that I constantly respond to as a person, How do I feel in this space, and how is the thing I'm making, how does it exist in this space?
Exactly.
And it's sometimes it's not logical or whatever, but these are the things I respond to, I respond to it in writing or as visual plastic arts, as I would call it. So it's always, that's what makes it exciting to me. To come between these very subtle feelings and ideas and so on, rather than something that's designed. I'm not following a program, more or less, unless it's my program.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, we're going to take a break here, because what I want to do is move over to this larger piece, which is the largest one in the show, and talk about the surface, because it kind of conveys a lot of the other sort of experimental things you did.
Yeah.
So we're going to zoom in on that here in just a second, and we'll take a quick break and refocus.
Okay.